I'm Lila Mercer, 26, a freelance fashion stylist and the forgotten cousin at family reunions. The hallway outside the banquet room of the Grand Marston Hotel smelled like old roses and starch, like a grandmother's closet, tightly shut and crammed with heirlooms no one asked for. The family had rented the entire West Wing for Aunt Claudia's 75th birthday bash, complete with engraved invitations, a harpist, and a white peach fondant cake that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I had shown up early, standing by the twin brass doors, clutching a small gift wrapped in velvet navy paper. The card inside simply said, "For the woman who never forgot her own shine." I meant it, even if she didn't always remember my name. The hostess at the check-in podium scanned the guest list and raised an eyebrow. Mercer. Was it, yes? Lila Mercer? She flipped back a page, then forward, her eyes skimming like she was brushing me off with her eyelashes. I don't see you here. I'm Claudia's niece, Margaret's daughter. Oh, she said, as if that explained something distasteful. Let me check with the family contact. Before I could speak, a familiar nasal voice sliced through the piano chords echoing from inside. Oh my God. She actually came. It was Tiffany, my cousin. Her blonde curls were coiled too tight, and her dress looked like it was vacuum-sealed to her hips. She wore confidence like cologne too much and meant to suffocate. She stepped toward the podium with a glass of something sparkling and leaned over to whisper, not so discreetly, to the hostess. She's not really part of the inner circle, she said. My aunt likes to keep things elegant. I swallowed. The hostess's glance turned from confusion to relief, as if being rude was now permitted. I'm sorry, she said, trying to smile. It's a limited seating event. Invitation only. Tiffany turned to me, flashing that half-pity, half-sneer expression that had defined our childhoods. You should have known. Lila, I mean, Aunt Claudia's parties aren't exactly DIY chic. There was a pause, a silence that belonged in art galleries, cold, polished, and echoing. I felt the burn of eyes from the other guests arriving behind me. It wasn't the rejection that stung. It was the rehearsed nature of it. Like they'd anticipated my arrival for no reason but to reject it. I flew in from Portland for this, I said quietly, not to argue, just to name what had happened. Tiffany tilted her head. Well, that was a mistake. The hostess nodded toward the elevator. The lobby bar is open if you'd like to wait for someone. I looked at the gift in my hand, then at the shimmer of chandeliers dancing across the ballroom's half-open doors. Laughter floated out like it belonged to a different dimension. Mine was cement. If you've ever stood outside your own bloodline's celebration, wondering why you were never enough if someone once told you you were too weird, too quiet, too ugly to stand beside the rest, leave a comment. I want to hear where you're watching from. And if your family ever made you feel invisible, click like, subscribe if you've ever promised yourself you'd prove them wrong. Because sometimes, you don't owe them an argument. You owe yourself a reckoning. I turned to walk. One foot had barely hit the tile when a sharp voice cracked the tension like glass under heel. Wait, is that her? Everyone turned. A man in a black turtleneck and tailored gray blazer emerged from the ballroom. I recognized him from somewhere TV maybe. His name hit the air before I remembered it myself. Tiago Morel, whispered someone behind me. The Vogue creative director. And Claudia's long-lost college friend. He strode past Tiffany, eyes locked on me. You're Lila Mercer. I blinked, unsure if I should lie or flee. Yes. His mouth broke into a delighted grin. I thought it was you. You're the one who styled the silent bloom shoot for Avon Mag. Right. The one with the ink-dyed veils and the mud-glass runway my throat dried. Yes. That was Me. I showed that spread to half my board last week. It was electric. Why didn't you say you were coming? He turned to Tiffany. Why wasn't she let in? Tiffany opened her mouth, but nothing coherent followed. Just the sound of entitlement collapsing. Come in, Tiago said to me, holding the door. Aunt Claudia's going to lose her mind when she sees you. She told me all about your work. She's been bragging. I stepped forward. Slowly. I crossed the threshold with my pulse in my ears and a quiet storm rising in my chest. All around. Faces turned. Chairs shifted. Murmurs passed like a wind no one could stop. And for the first time in years, I watched Tiffany go silent. The ballroom didn't feel like it belonged to me. Not at first. The moment I stepped in, the walls felt too gold, too soft, too filled with people whose names I had half forgotten or had never known properly. They all wore versions of the same polite face, mildly intrigued, cautiously skeptical, like I was a stray animal that had wandered into a polished home. But Tiago led me through the space like I was royalty returning from exile. I could hear Tiffany's heels behind me, her pace irregular, unsure whether to retreat or follow. Tiago moved fast, weaving past circular tables adorned with hydrangea towers and floating candles. At the far end sat Aunt Claudia, propped like a duchess in her throne of brocade and pale lace, her white curls pinned into a crown. She was speaking with a man in suspenders until she caught sight of me, and her face changed instantly. Not the kind of surprise you fake, but something deeper. Recognition. Even pride. Oh my God, she said, rising as fast as her 75-year-old bones would let her. Is that my Lila? I hadn't heard her call me my anything in a decade. Tiago gestured. Your niece is an artist. A true original. I've been waiting to meet her for months. She turned to me. Her voice lowered but not soft. I didn't know you were coming. I wasn't sure I'd be welcome. Then you're braver than the rest of them, she said, and pulled me into a hug. You've grown into something sharp. I like sharp things. Around us, people were turning in their chairs, lowering their forks mid-bite. I saw my mother from across the room, Margaret, the woman who raised me on practical advice and comparison charts. She was blinking in confusion, holding a flute of champagne like she wasn't sure what part of the evening this was. Tiffany arrived seconds later, still clutching her glass like a shield. Hi, Aunt Claudia. Everything all right? Aunt Claudia didn't answer. She took my hand and raised it. This one didn't just show up. She arrived. It wasn't a line meant to be dramatic. It was just her. But the silence after it made it cinematic. Did you know? Tiago added, scanning the room with that showman's flair, that Lila is going to be featured in next month's Vogue full spread. Creative direction and styling. Her concept. A rare thing these days. Pure voice. A beat. A full second where you could hear cutlery clink back into porcelain. Then murmurs. My uncle leaned toward someone and whispered, and someone else's hand went to their mouth. Not in horror, just surprise. As if they had blinked and I had aged 10 years in front of them. Tiffany's face didn't fall. She was too good for that. But her mouth twitched at the corners, the way it used to when she got second place. She opened her mouth but closed it without a sound. I barely registered the rest of the party. Aunt Claudia introduced me to 3 people from her college years and someone who owned a vineyard. I answered questions, nodded, smiled where appropriate. Inside, I was still catching up. My feet ached in the heels I'd almost thrown away before the flight. My dress, a matte black midi I'd thrifted and stitched with rough pearl buttons, suddenly felt couture. But the strangest part wasn't the attention. It was the space they gave me. For the first time in years, no one interrupted me. Eventually, I stepped outside the ballroom for air, past the lobby, near the courtyard's stone fountain. The winter air slapped me awake. The stars above were pale, like the sky was made of gauze. I sank onto a bench and inhaled until my ribs hurt. Thought I might find you here. It was Tiago again. He sat beside me, uninvited, but not unwelcome. He lit a slim cigarette and tilted his head back. I didn't plan this, I said quickly. I wasn't trying to make a statement. Didn't look like you needed to. He blew out smoke. They made the statement for you. All you had to do was show up. I looked down at my lap. They've always seen me as the weird one, the quiet one. Tiffany was the one everyone called pretty. He shrugged. Pretty is currency, but originality, that's inheritance. Do you really think I belong in a place like this? No. He smiled at me sideways. You belong in places like Milan, or backstage in Paris, or maybe on some farm in Iceland shooting barefoot models under northern lights. This is just where your name got cleared. It was a strange comfort. Not overstated, just clean. He stood up and flicked his cigarette into the fountain. Enjoy it while it's fresh, he said. They'll get used to you soon. Then they'll forget how shocked they were. Happens to all the greats. He left me with that, and I stayed a little longer, letting the cold bite through the seams of my sleeves. My hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight that had lifted. I re-entered the ballroom to find my mother waiting near the hallway. She had the same mouth as me, downturned corners, sharp upper lip, but hers was taut. You could have told me, she said. I didn't think you'd care. She nodded, not denying it. Vogue. Really, yes. She looked at me a long time. I used to think all that fashion stuff was a distraction, but you look like you built something out of it. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. She wasn't apologizing, just adjusting. And maybe that was enough. Back inside, people had started dancing. Aunt Claudia waved at me from her chair and mouthed something I didn't catch. Across the room, Tiffany sat alone at the far end of a table, her expression unreadable. I didn't feel superior, just separate, like I had walked through one door and left her on the other side. I stepped near the cake table and found a slice of peach fondant waiting. Someone had written my name on the dessert card, almost as if it had always been there. And as I lifted the fork to my lips, someone behind me said, "Smile." I turned just in time for the photographer to catch the moment. It was only later that I learned the photo would go viral, not because I looked like a cover girl, but because I looked like someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to belong. The photo from the party landed on social media 2 days later. Someone had tagged me, one of the guests. Maybe a distant cousin's friend or a fashion blogger who happened to be there with a +1. I saw it during a layover in Denver, sitting at a quiet gate with a cinnamon bagel and coffee that had long gone cold. The caption read, "When the girl they mocked shows up looking like a Vogue editorial iconic energy." I didn't share it. I didn't comment. But I read every response. Her expression, that's silent revenge. She's the kind of woman who grows in silence and returns crowned. Someone tag Vogue. Oh, wait. She's already there. I scrolled and scrolled, my thumb trembling slightly. Not from ego, not from pride, just from the disbelief that strangers could see me without filters, without history, without the Mercer family legacy of careful exclusion. By the time I landed back in Portland, my inbox had exploded. My agency forwarded a request from a luxury brand based in Tokyo. Another magazine wanted an interview. And Vogue. They moved up the cover reveal date. The editor wrote personally, "We want to frame your work as reclamation, not just of fashion, but of voice." Reclamation. That word clung to my ribs for weeks. But not everything changed overnight. At home, my apartment remained exactly as I'd left it. Piles of fabric in the corner, a mannequin half dressed in an upcycled wedding gown, rent overdue by 3 days. My cat, Delphine, meowed from the windowsill like nothing had happened. She rubbed against my leg, then knocked over the mug I'd left behind half full of green tea, now moldy and dark. I unpacked slowly. The dress from the party still carried the scent of candle wax and rose water. I hung it on the door, where it swayed like a ghost of the girl I had been before they saw me. That week, Tiffany sent a text. Tiffany. That was some entrance lol. Congrats or whatever. Maybe we can do lunch sometime. I stared at it for a long time, then muted the conversation. I wasn't angry, just full. Like my cup had been empty for so long that now, with even a little water, I needed to let it settle before pouring it anywhere else. My mother, on the other hand, called. She rarely did. This time, she left a voicemail. Lila, I know I haven't always understood your path, but I watched the Vogue video this morning. Your eyes looked free. I guess that's what you wanted. Huh. I hope it's enough now. Call me if you want. Was it enough? I thought about that as I walked into my studio the next morning. It was really just a renovated garage behind my apartment, with frosted windows and a humming heater in the corner. The place where I'd cried over failed prototypes, spent nights piecing together looks with borrowed fabric, and once slept under a table after sewing for 20 hours straight. The walls were still taped with inspiration images, old photos of Lisa von Sagrives, paper clippings of weird architecture, torn pages from poetry books. In the center of the room stood the unfinished project I had been avoiding for months, a personal piece. A dress made of rejection letters, actual paper, stitched together with black silk thread, letters from fashion schools, magazines, brands that had once told me I wasn't the right fit. I had laminated each one, cut them into panels, reinforced the edges with fishbone stays. It was ugly, brilliantly ugly, unwearable, but honest. I'd hidden it under a tarp before the trip. Now, I pulled it off and stood in front of the form. The next day, I posted a photo of the dress to my design account. No caption, no hashtags. Within an hour, Vogue reshared it with one line. The gown of becoming. I didn't go viral. I went quiet. The kind of quiet that draws in the people who understand. 1 week later, I received an envelope. It was ivory, heavy, embossed with Aunt Claudia's initials. Inside, a handwritten letter. My dearest Lila, you changed the air in that room. I saw it. I won't pretend I always treated you with clarity. I was born in a world where women had to be ornamental or silent to survive. You chose something else, Motion. I envied it. I want you to have something. Enclosed is a key. It opens the garden shed at the back of my house. It's not a shed. It's a studio. I used to sculpt there when I thought no one was watching. I stopped decades ago. Maybe you'll make it holy again. Don't send a thank you. Just use it. That'll be thanks enough. Yours in truth, Claudia. I cried. Not because it was a gift, but because it was the first thing she'd ever given me that came without condition. 2 weeks later, I flew back. I didn't tell anyone but Claudia. She greeted me barefoot, holding a mug of black coffee, her cane leaning against the porch. The shed was more than a studio, it was sanctuary. Sunlight filtered through stained glass. The walls smelled like pine and old clay. Dust floated in slow patterns, undisturbed. There were shelves of half-finished sculptures, and a long table under a skylight. This was supposed to be mine, she said, stepping inside with me. But I grew tired of waiting to be seen. I turned to her. And now I don't need to be seen, she said. I just need to see. We sat in silence for a long time. No performance, No backhanded praise, just two women, different generations, finally stripped of decoration. Before I left, she handed me an envelope, another letter, but this one was sealed in wax. For when they try to push you out again, she said, read it before you walk back in. I never asked what it said. Some weeks later, I returned to the city. Tokyo reached out again. So did a director in Berlin. I kept creating quietly, refusing to shout, but never stepping back. Then came the Vogue cover shoot. They asked me to style myself. No restrictions. Just show us what you've been hiding. I chose a simple black coat I made in the studio. High collar, hidden embroidery on the inside hem. Silence is not absence. The photographer caught the shot when I wasn't posing. I was standing alone, facing the wind. My hair tangled, my mouth neutral, my eyes clear. It went live on a Wednesday. That same evening, Tiffany posted a photo on her page. A throwback. Us at age 10. Me in crooked braids and overalls. Her in a princess dress. The caption read, "Never underestimate the quiet ones. Proud of you. L." It didn't feel fake. It just felt late. But late is better than never, especially when you've already arrived. The Vogue issue hit newsstands with the kind of quiet thunder that ripples beneath polite conversation. No headlines scream my name, no grand proclamations, just a single cover. Matte finish. A black and white image of me standing still, one hand in the pocket of that coat, wind catching the edge like a whisper. At first, I avoided stores. I told myself I didn't want to be seen staring at my own face. But the truth was, I didn't know how to look at myself yet. Not like that. Not through the lens of someone else's validation. It was Delphine who made me go. She'd knocked over her food bowl with surgical precision, meowing in outrage as if she hadn't eaten in hours. I wrapped myself in a long scarf and coat and wandered down to the corner store just before closing, grabbing a small bag of kibble. As I approached the register, I saw it. Not the magazine first, but the headline beside it. The Silent Rise of Lila Mercer. A voice in fabric. I reached for it hesitantly, like it might disappear under my fingers. My photo stared back at me, calm, neutral, unknowable. The man behind the counter looked up and froze. Wait, is this you? I nodded slowly. He grinned. No way. I mean, this is you. Right here. That's wild. Do you want to sign one? I laughed, more out of nervousness than joy. I don't think that's really a thing. Totally is now, he said, pulling out a black Sharpie. My sister studies fashion. She's gonna freak out. I signed the top right corner. For the first time in my life, my name felt full. Back home, the emails kept coming. Invites to panels, lectures, brand collaborations. They wanted the version of me that had now been named visionary, but I was still living inside the body that had been called too much, too plain, too weird for most of my life. I tried to keep it balanced. For every offer I accepted, I turned one down, one afternoon, while reorganizing my studio. My phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in years. Hannah, my older cousin, Tiffany's sister, the one who had moved away before any of us understood what escape could look like. Hannah. Hey, saw the cover. About time someone told our story in stitches. I hesitated, then replied. Me didn't know it was ours to share. Hannah. It is. It's just that no one else ever asked what we saw. We met for coffee the next day. She had aged gently silver in her curls, laugh lines forming soft parentheses around her mouth. She hugged me like she'd never let go. You always knew, she said. Even when we were kids, you saw it clearer than any of us. Saw what the lie. That if we were just pretty enough, quiet enough, normal enough. They'd let us in. We talked for 2 hours. About everything and nothing. About the way our family praised silence only when it came from women. About the way they handed out love like a riddle, solve it. And maybe you're worthy. You solved it? She said before leaving. You made beauty out of the exile. A few weeks later, the Tokyo project began. They flew me in business class, sent a translator, booked a minimalist studio with curved white walls and floor-to-ceiling windows. I was to design a line inspired by imperfection kintsugi, the art of gold-filled cracks, beauty through fracture. I poured everything into the pieces. A coat with hand-sewn flaws, lined in gold thread, a dress with asymmetrical sleeves and deliberate burn marks, a skirt made from scraps that whispered when you walked. During fittings, the models often paused in front of the mirror. One of them, Emmy, touched the gold seam of a sleeve and said, "It feels like memory, not just clothes." I stayed in Tokyo for 2 months, long enough to feel like I belonged to silence again, long enough to forget how sharp the world can be. And then one night, back in my hotel, I opened the wax-sealed letter Claudia had given me. Lila, if you're reading this, they've likely tried to tell you who you are again. Maybe they're being kinder this time. Maybe they're applauding. Don't be fooled. Praise is still a leash if it's handed out like correction. You don't owe them performance. You don't owe them explanation. You owe the girl you used to be one thing only: truth. Stay strange, stay clear, stay yours. With love, Claudia. I folded it back slowly and cried harder than I had the night Vogue called me. When I returned to the States, there were new requests waiting. One from the university I'd been rejected from years ago. They wanted me to teach a masterclass. Another from a podcast titled Women Who Changed the Thread, asking me to be their next guest. And then there was the invitation from Tiffany. A handwritten card this time. Elegant, gold-trimmed, the kind she'd once used to exclude. You're invited to the Mercer family women's brunch hosted by Tiffany. No apology. Just my name in real ink. I didn't reply right away. I let the card sit on my shelf next to a dried sprig of lavender and a chipped thimble. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. So I went. I wore a charcoal blazer stitched with iridescent thread under the lapels. No makeup. Hair pulled back. Neutral. Clean. When I walked in, the room fell quiet again, but it wasn't the silence of disbelief. It was memory. Tiffany approached, her expression somewhere between cautious and soft. You look good. I am good. She paused. I was awful to you. And not just once. I know. I thought. She hesitated. I thought it made me stronger. And did it? She shook her head. No. It made me mean. The room buzzed faintly as conversations resumed. Somewhere, someone popped champagne. I leaned in. You know, you weren't wrong. She blinked. About what I wasn't made to stand with you. She frowned. I was made to stand apart. Tiffany didn't argue. She just nodded. Later, as I left, one of the older aunts grabbed my wrist gently. Your grandmother would have been proud. I smiled. I think she would have been surprised. That evening, I walked alone through the city. Rain tapped gently on the sidewalks, mist rising from the gutters like secrets. I passed a bookstore. My face was in the window again, this time on the cover of an anthology about women in design. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. I knew who I was. And finally, so did they. 3 months passed. The press cooled. The DMs slowed. The world moved on. But something inside me didn't. I wasn't chasing anything anymore. And yet, I wasn't standing still either. I spent my mornings in the studio, Afternoons walking with Delphine perched like royalty in her carrier. Evenings stitching pieces no one would see, not for a client, not for a magazine, just for the sake of shape, fabric, and silence. It was during one of those silent weeks that I received a message from a name I hadn't seen since high school, Miss Archer, my old art teacher. She was the first adult who had ever said the words "you're allowed to be different" out loud to me, back when I didn't even know I needed permission. Her email was brief. "Lila, I'm retiring this spring. Before I leave, I'm organizing a final showcase of students who became artists in the world. I'd like you to return and exhibit. You were always a question mark I believed in. No pressure, just presence. Miss A." At first, I almost didn't respond. Not because I didn't want to go, but because I did. And returning to the place that birthed all my worst doubts felt like walking barefoot across glass. Still, a week later, I stood in front of Pine Hollow High's rust-red brick walls with a garment bag in one hand and a box of old sketches in the other. The hallways smelled the same pencil shavings, cheap floor wax, and teenage fear. The kind that burrows under your skin and makes your spine stiff even as an adult. But this time, I didn't shrink. Miss Archer met me outside the auditorium. Her hair was fully white now, but her eyes hadn't changed. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "You always circled back to the truth, even when it scared you. We didn't talk about the past. Not about the time Tiffany had graffitied my locker with the words, 'freak show.' Not about the years I ate lunch in the supply closet because I couldn't bear the noise of the cafeteria. Instead, we talked fabric, line, shadow. She was still an artist. She always had been." I hung my piece in the center of the auditorium stage. It wasn't a dress or a coat. It was a full installation, a spiraling tower of translucent muslin panels, each one dyed with ink patterns made from my own fingerprints. Up close, the fingerprints formed letters, not legible words, just fragments, ghosts of every rejection, every silent scream. Every night I'd whispered to myself, "They're wrong about you." At the base of the structure, I placed a single card, unseen, unmade. The night of the show, the auditorium filled slowly. Students in oversized sweatshirts, parents holding coffee cups, alumni I hadn't seen in a decade. One of them walked up to me quietly near the snacks table. "Lila, I don't know if you remember me. I was in your year. Lucas. We had geometry together." I smiled. "Yeah, I remember. I just wanted to say, back then, I always thought you were kind of—" He hesitated, then looked down. "Not scary. Just, like, impossible to understand. You had this way of being somewhere else." "That sounds accurate. But tonight," he motioned toward the exhibit, "you made it feel like maybe I was just blind." I didn't say anything. Some things don't need response, only breath. Later that evening, Miss Archer stood at the podium and called out each artist. I was last. I walked up slowly, the way someone might approach a still lake aware of their reflection, but not drowning in it. She introduced me without a title, no list of accomplishments, just, "This is Lila Mercer. She made something true. That's all you need to know." I spoke only once that night. I used to think being unseen meant I was invisible, but now I know I was just unfinished. Applause didn't come immediately. It came slow, staggered, the way rain begins before a storm. Some clapped out of politeness, others out of recognition. One girl in the front row cried quietly, her head down. After the event, I returned to the studio. The muslin tower remained packed in its case, but its echo lingered in the room like perfume. And then came the message that would shift everything again. A producer from a documentary series reached out. They were doing a season called Redefining Legacy about women who redefined the very thing that once excluded them. He wanted me to be one of the profiles. I told him I wasn't interested. He pressed gently. You wouldn't be performing. You'd be reflecting. We'd just follow your process, the silences, the choices, the meaning. The phrase caught me. The meaning. I agreed. On one condition, that they film the next piece I was making, a private commission, anonymous, for a woman who'd reached out after the Vogue issue. She had survived a car crash that left her body covered in scars. She wanted a dress that honored them, not hid them. She sent me her measurements with notes like right shoulder burns start at clavicle, trail to elbow, back spine slightly off center, left hip metal pins visible beneath skin. I designed a dress of broken seams, exposed stitching, irregular panels. I used translucent silk over copper wire, letting it pucker in places and smooth in others. It wasn't flawless. It breathed. The crew filmed me as I sewed. No interviews. Just sound the whisper of thread, the hum of the machine, the scratch of pencil on pattern paper. When she arrived to try it on, she didn't speak at first, just ran her fingers over every exposed edge. Then, in a voice, barely audible, she said, "It's like you turned my body into a hymn." The documentary aired 6 months later. I didn't watch it the night it came out. I was in the garden shed studio Claudia had left me, lighting a single candle. I sat at the work table, staring at the empty space where the next idea would soon form. When I finally watched it, it was 3 a.m. The room was quiet, the sky outside bruised with dawn. I watched myself on screen, not as a performer, but as a presence. The final scene showed me adjusting the copper silk dress on the mannequin, stepping back, and whispering something to myself. They called it ugly. I called it alive. And then, the screen faded. In the weeks that followed, the messages came not from fashion people, but from survivors, burn victims, girls who hated mirrors, women who had been told they were too much, too strange, too dark, too loud, too real. One message read, "Your dress made me think I could exist outside the apology." I printed that line and pinned it above my desk. I didn't need trophies. I didn't need every door to open. I had my own house now, with windows facing the sky. And when I looked out, I no longer asked for recognition. I simply stitched my name into the lining of every silence I'd once feared. Spring arrived slowly that year, dragging winter's breath behind it like a heavy coat. The cherry trees in Portland bloomed early, and the petals fell like confetti across sidewalks where no parade had passed. I walked those streets each morning, a thermos in one hand, Delphine in the other, still in her ridiculous velvet harness, and watched the world move without demanding anything from me. For the first time, my name wasn't echoing through inboxes or sliding across magazine spreads. The Vogue feature had settled into history, the Tokyo line had been released and reviewed, and the documentary had run its course. The silence felt sacred. I didn't chase it away. That month, I got a handwritten note from Claudia's estate manager, Lila. As per her final wishes, you've been named the sole heir of the garden studio and its adjoining plot. Claudia wanted you to keep creating, not just for the world, but for yourself. No public announcements, no press, just peace. W. I sat with that letter on my lap, knees folded beneath me on the floor, while the sunlight shifted across the hardwood like a slow tide. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stayed still and let it wash through. The following weekend, I visited the studio again, this time not with work in mind, but with an offering. I brought fabric scraps, each piece from a garment I had made during some turning point in my life. A torn corner of the black Vogue coat. A sleeve from the first thrifted dress I altered as a teenager. a swatch of copper silk from the scarred woman's commission. I laid them out on the table like puzzle pieces, not yet knowing what they'd become. I wasn't designing anything. I was remembering. In the quiet. I found a small wooden box beneath Claudia's old shelf. Inside was a collection of miniature clay busts, each no taller than a thumb, and a faded photo of her in her 20s, covered in earth, smiling without fear. Tucked beneath the photo was a note in Claudia's handwriting. You are never too late to become your real self. Just don't wait to be invited. I sat with that line for hours. The weight of it, the permission of it, the sorrow it carried for the years she'd lost to silence. I knew then that I wasn't going to return to the fashion cycle, not the way they expected. Instead, I created something smaller, a project called Thread Marks. I designed 12 pieces, one for each month, each one built from personal artifacts, things lost, broken, gifted, or passed down. Every piece carried a hidden element of someone else's story. My grandmother's lace, Claudia's sculpting cloth, the velvet from a stranger's mourning dress I found in a donation bin. The collection wasn't made for sale or publication. It would be shown only once. I sent out 12 invitations, handwritten, no RSVP, to people who had crossed my life like whispers. Miss Archer, Hannah, the woman from the copper dress, Lucas from high school, even my mother. I wasn't sure who would come. The showing was held at the studio. No stage, no spotlight. Just a long row of mannequins placed beneath the skylight, bathed in natural light. I arranged seating in a circle, like a gathering rather than a presentation. The pieces stood between us like witnesses. I didn't give speeches. I didn't explain. Each person received a card beside the piece that had been made with them in mind, not labeled with names, but with the kind of words you only hear once in your life and never forget. For the one who waited without resentment. For the one who stayed soft when it was easier to harden. For the one who held the silence together. The last seat was empty. It belonged to Tiffany. She hadn't replied. I hadn't expected her to. But as I stood near the window, watching shadows grow long across the floor, I saw a flash of rust-colored fabric outside. She entered slowly, holding a single wildflower. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, or maybe grief. I didn't think I had the right, she said quietly. You never lost it. She took the last chair. I watched her reading the card at her seat. For the one who changed, even if too late. She didn't cry. Neither did I. After the showing, no one clapped. We simply sat there, the way people do after something holy has happened. It wasn't fashion anymore. It was ritual. When everyone had left, I stood in the studio alone. The mannequins were still. The air held the scent of lavender and thread. I unpinned a note I had taped near the door weeks earlier, a phrase I had scribbled at midnight and almost thrown away. What they called too much was always just enough for something greater. I folded it, placed it in my pocket, and turned off the lights. In the months that followed, I stepped away from the industry almost entirely, not out of bitterness, but clarity. I taught workshops in small towns. I helped teenage girls design dresses from paper and light. I hosted thread gatherings at the studio, where people brought items of emotional weight wedding dresses, military uniforms, baby blankets, and we created pieces together from them, not to wear, but to remember. Sometimes Vogue emailed, so did Paris. I answered, kindly, but I didn't return. One morning, I received a letter from a young girl in Brazil. She had seen the documentary with her mother, who had facial scars. They watched it together after her classmates had mocked her for how she looked. When I saw your clothes, the girl wrote, I thought maybe my scars were stories, not mistakes. I cried that day, not from sadness, from recognition, because I had spent so many years trying to erase myself, polish myself, shrink myself to fit a room that was never mine. And now, the room I had built with my own two hands was opening for others, and I understood, finally, what Claudia had meant. Praise is a leash if it comes with rules, but peace that comes when you no longer need to be seen to be true. I still walk those cherry blossom streets, still drink too much tea, still burn my fingers with hot glue and forget to eat when I'm working. Delphine's getting older, slower, but still sits beside me as I stitch into the night. Sometimes I sit on the porch of the studio and write little notes to my younger self. I never mail them. I just leave them tucked into books, or under plant pots, or folded in jacket linings. Maybe someone will find them one day, or maybe they're only meant for me. One reads, "They said you were too ugly to stand, so you learned how to stand alone. And then, they realized you were the only one who had built her own ground. I didn't win. I didn't conquer. I simply arrived and stayed." 3 years later, I received an invitation from a museum in Berlin. They were curating an exhibit titled The Forgotten Line Fashion as Memory, a collection that focused on garments not as objects, but as living archives, wounds stitched into beauty, grief sewn into form. They wanted to feature one of my early pieces, specifically, the muslin tower I had once displayed at my old high school. I hesitated. That piece wasn't about beauty. It wasn't about triumph. It was about surviving without a name, about holding together long enough to become something that could be unboxed without shame. Still, I agreed, but I didn't ship it. I carried it myself. Flying to Berlin alone in late autumn felt poetic. The plane cut across dark skies like a seam-ripping fabric. I sat by the window with a journal I never wrote in and watched the clouds blur beneath us. In my lap was a smaller, folded version of the installation, carefully pressed between layers of soft linen. I had restitched it days before. Some fingerprints had faded, some had deepened. I arrived in the city to light rain and silence. My hotel was modest, and the room overlooked a narrow street where leaves danced in tight circles. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with the tower, unfolded it panel by panel, pressed my palm to each fingerprint as if blessing the ghosts one last time. The museum was housed in an old train station, wide-arched ceilings, beams scarred by time, echoes traveling farther than sound should allow. My exhibit was placed near the center, under a glass dome. They gave it its own light, subtle but reverent. As I assembled it, I overheard two curators speaking in German. She built it out of rejection letters. Yes. And stitched them together as if they belonged. Like a skin you decide to wear instead of hide. The opening night was quiet. Invitations had been sent to artists, philosophers, textile historians, and survivors, people who understood that clothes are not decoration, but declaration. Among the guests, a woman in her 50s approached me. She wore a scarf so thin it floated when she moved. "Are you the one who made the dress from Rejection?" she asked. "I am. My daughter. She took a blade to her body last year. She said she couldn't live in a skin that no one wanted. But she saw your documentary, and then your installation on YouTube. And one day, she picked up a needle." I didn't speak. There was nothing to say that would match the weight of her voice. She started sewing her scars into fabric, not to hide them, just to hold them. Her eyes glistened. "She's here tonight. Over there." She pointed to a girl with cropped hair and heavy boots. The girl stood completely still, staring up at the muslin, as if reading it line by line. I nodded slowly. "Tell her I see her, even if I never speak to her." The woman took my hand. "You already did." I stayed until the lights dimmed and the exhibit emptied. Then I sat beneath the tower in the dark and listened. You'd be surprised how fabric speaks when no one's looking. It rustles with breath, with memory, with all the hands that shaped it. The next morning, I visited a small bookstore near Alexanderplatz. It wasn't planned. I just wandered in, drawn by the scent of paper and dust. A young man behind the counter recognized me instantly. "You're the one who stitched the voices," he said, offering no introduction. "My sister sent me the article. She said your work made her believe she wasn't crazy for remembering things through touch." We talked for a while. I bought 3 books I'd never heard of. Before I left, he handed me a folded note. "She wanted me to give you this if I ever saw you. Said she wouldn't have the courage to say it to your face." I took the note, thanked him, and stepped outside. I didn't read it immediately. I walked first, under the iron-gray sky, across cobblestone streets, past buildings that had survived fire and falling. I sat by a canal, unwrapped the paper, and read, "Dear Lila, you didn't rescue me. You didn't even know I existed, but your work stood in the same fire I was burning in, and it didn't scream. It didn't beg. It just stood. And somehow, that was enough. I've learned to sew now. I stitch words into sleeves. I don't know what I'm making yet, but I know it's mine. Thank you for giving silence shape. Mira." I folded the note slowly, placed it inside my coat, and watched a small bird land near my feet. It didn't sing. It just looked up at me, then flew off again. When I returned home to Portland, something had changed. The studio looked the same. Delphine still greeted me with that judgmental stare only old cats possess, but I felt different, like someone who had walked into her own myth, only to discover it wasn't a myth at all, just memory, finally given a voice. I spent the next year building not a collection, but a sanctuary, a traveling workshop, mobile, fabric walls, wheels beneath the frame. I called it the Stitch House. I drove it from city to city, parking in schoolyards, hospital lots, women's shelters, community centers. I taught people how to sew not to become designers, but to become witnesses of their own lives. We stitched grief into pillowcases, regret into capes, joy into messy, crooked quilts that laughed when they unfolded. I didn't teach perfection. I taught presence. In one town, a child stitched her mother's last voicemail into a dress collar. In another, a man wove his late husband's name into the inside of a glove. In all of them, I saw something rise that no industry could ever bottle truth without an audience. The final stop of the Stitch House tour was back where everything began. I returned to the Grand Marston Hotel. The same golden doors, the same carved archways. But this time, I was the one on the guest list. I had reserved the West Wing not for a party, but for a gathering. I invited everyone. Tiffany came. So did my mother. Even Claudia's niece from her late husband's side, who I'd barely known. The room was filled with people who had once doubted me, or forgotten me, or quietly rooted for me, but never said it. I didn't dress up. I wore an oversized linen shirt with tiny names stitched into the hem. Names of strangers who had written to me over the years. Their stories, their truths, their resilience. The only speech I gave was this: "You once said I was too ugly to stand. And now I know I was never supposed to stand in your place. I was meant to stand alone, until others saw they could stand too." Silence followed. Not shameful, not awkward. Reverent, then applause. Quiet at first, then rising like a wave that didn't need a storm to be powerful. I didn't smile for the cameras. I didn't pose. I just stood, at the center, where I had always belonged. The months after the Stitch House tour passed in stillness. No red carpets, no headlines, no features. And I liked it that way. I returned to the garden studio and rebuilt the shelves. I cataloged scraps from the tour fragments of stitched heartbreak, patched joy, grief folded into soft sleeves. I labeled them by city, not by name: Detroit shoulder, Seattle ribbon, Phoenix tear-shaped lining. Each one hummed with memory, but none screamed. I didn't need fame anymore. I needed ritual. One morning, as the first frost webbed across the studio windows, a small box arrived at my door. No return address. Inside a square of fabric, forest green with faded red stitching, and a note. This is from my mother's wedding dress. She left when I was 7. I kept the hem. I didn't know why, until I saw your work. I haven't sewn since she left, but last night, I did. The thread broke 5 times. I kept going anyway. Thank you for teaching me that I could. A stranger who's still stitching. I kept the fabric, pinned it to the back wall of the studio, beside the muslin fingerprint panel and Claudia's old sculpting cloth. Every week, more came. Packages wrapped in brown paper, email notes printed and tied with ribbon. Someone even sent me the inner lining of their childhood jacket with the words stitched inside. He left. But I stayed warm. I didn't reply to most. There wasn't always a return address, but I began sewing the fragments together quietly, obsessively into a tapestry that wasn't meant to hang in any museum. I called it the cloak of staying. It had no shape, just layers. It draped from the ceiling and spilled onto the floor like water. Each scrap bore emotion: a denim cuff from a runaway's bag, a veil torn from a wedding that never happened, a swaddle cloth from a NICU crib. Some were bright, some dull, some smelled of perfume, others of fire. I added no pattern, no symmetry. It wasn't fashion. It was breath made visible. And one evening, while adjusting a square of lace from an elderly woman in Norway who had lost both sons, I caught my reflection in the studio's corner mirror. I looked older. Not old, but older. Softer in the edges. My hair a little more silver near the temples, my hands more sure. And I didn't miss the past. Not the applause. Not the ambition. Not the revenge. What I missed, strangely, was her. The girl I had once been. The one standing outside the banquet doors. Velvet-wrapped gift in hand. Cheeks flushed not from makeup but humiliation. Told she was too ugly to be included. Too strange to be beautiful. I remembered how tight her throat felt when she turned away. How she walked to the elevator without crying. How she held that pain like a sacred object in her pocket, refusing to throw it away, even though no one would blame her if she did. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I made a dress just for her. Not to wear, not to show, to honor. I called it the first door. It was stitched in silence, over 5 nights, deep indigo linen, soft and faded like forgotten sky. The inside lining carried words from the very first rejection letter I had ever received at 16. I wrote it out by hand, mirrored it backward, then embroidered it with gray thread into the inner hem. On the outside, I added nothing. No embellishment, no name. Just a single clasp at the collar, a brass button shaped like an open hand. When it was finished, I placed it on a mannequin and left it near the window. I sat across from it with tea and whispered, "You were always enough. They just didn't have the language to see you." That night, it snowed. The studio felt like a cathedral. Outside, everything was white and blank and waiting. I slept in the studio that night and dreamt of her standing not outside the door, but opening it, inside the dream. She didn't walk into the party. She stepped into a forest. She let the velvet-wrapped gift fall behind her and walked barefoot across pine needles, whispering to no one and everyone, "I am not ugly. I am unfinished." When I woke, I wept. Not for her. For all the girls who had been her. For all the women who had carried those words ugly, wrong, invisible like stones in their pockets, thinking the weight was theirs to bear forever. A week later, I received an unexpected email. Subject Vogue Anniversary Edition, a request. They were compiling a retrospective on the most meaningful covers of the last decade. Mine had been selected. The editor wanted a new interview, a reshoot, a chance to reflect on what fame had taught me. I didn't decline, but I didn't say yes either. Instead, I replied, "If you come, don't bring lights, don't bring makeup, bring a handheld camera, bring silence. If you want my truth, you'll find it here, in the studio, in the cloth. But I won't pose, not this time. I'll just sit and sew. You can watch. Or not. That's all I offer now." They agreed. 2 weeks later, they arrived, one producer, one quiet camera woman, no glam team, no assistant. They sat on the studio floor while I stitched the final edge of the cloak of staying. I didn't speak until the very end. I stood, draped the unfinished cloak over the mannequin, and said, "This isn't mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who thought they had to hide, everyone who survived by staying, everyone who stood without applause." They asked if I wanted to end with a quote. I said no. Instead, I walked to the corner, pulled a small envelope from the old drawer, and handed it to them. It was the original baptism card, the one they'd laughed at all those years ago, the one with my name scrawled in childish ink, faded now, folded a dozen times, but inside a tiny slip of paper, a trust certificate, signed and sealed by Claudia Mercer, a legal fund she'd opened when I was born. "Did you know?" they asked. "No," I said. "She planted it before I ever had to defend myself. That's what real love looks like." They left quietly. The article ran a month later. No cover, no title, just an image. Me, mid-stitch, face half-shadowed, framed by the fabric of the cloak. The caption underneath read, "She didn't rewrite the rules. She walked past them, holding her own pattern." And beneath it, in small print, "Too ugly to stand? Someone. Once. Now everyone else sits. Lila Mercer." The article went viral. I didn't read the comments. I went back to the studio, poured tea, threaded my needle, and began again. Spring returned with the sound of distant wind chimes and plum blossoms shedding their petals like forgotten promises. I found myself waking earlier before the sun rose, before the city's hum began. There was a stillness in that hour I had come to crave. I would sit on the steps of the garden studio wrapped in a blanket, tea steeping by my side, and just listen. No agenda, no deadline, just breath, and the quiet voice that lived underneath all the others. One morning, I received a letter with no postage. It had been slid under the studio door during the night. The envelope was thin, ivory, the ink on the front written in shaky cursive for the girl who taught me to unname my shame. Inside, a photograph, black and white, grainy. It showed a girl, maybe 11 or 12, standing in front of a mirror with marker-written insults all over her shirt fat. Worthless. Mistake. Nothing special. The next photo was the same girl, older now, wearing a rough, hand-stitched jacket. On the back, those same words but crossed out with golden thread. There was no signature. Only one more sentence written at the bottom of the page. I didn't learn to love myself. I learned to stop lying about who I was. I kept the photo on my work table, propped between two bobbins. I looked at it often, not for inspiration, but for truth. Because so much of my life had been spent trying to prove something to the world. But that girl, she had only proven something to herself. And that was enough. That week, I began a new piece. No name, No intention. Just thread and instinct. I used raw cotton unbleached. Thick. Almost stubborn. It resisted the needle. I liked that. I wasn't making it to be beautiful. I was making it to be real. I stitched crooked lines. I tore some seams halfway and mended them from the inside with soft velvet. I left the threads dangling, like thoughts you don't need to finish. When it was done, I placed it over a blank mannequin and stepped back. It didn't look impressive. It looked alive, as if it had listened to someone cry, as if it had survived a betrayal and stayed anyway. That same day, my mother called. She rarely did now. Not because of anger, but because we'd stopped pretending. We'd found peace in fewer words. But this time, her voice trembled. "Your uncle passed," she said. "George, I know you two were never close. We weren't. He was the one who had once told me at a Christmas dinner, 'You know, it's a shame you're not more like Tiffany. She could marry a doctor. You just talk a lot.' But even so, I felt a hollow ring somewhere beneath my ribs. 'I thought you should know,' she continued. 'There's a family service next week. You don't have to come.' I didn't answer immediately. 'I'll come,' I said finally. 'Not for him. For you.' The chapel was modest. Soft light filtered through stained glass windows, abstract shapes, not saints. I wore black, but not out of mourning. I wore it like armor. My mother met me at the door with a stiff nod. We sat beside each other, not touching, but not apart either. Tiffany was there, of course. So were the cousins. Some looked at me, some didn't. It didn't matter anymore. After the service, as people gathered in the annex room for cookies and awkward silences, I stood near the coat rack, sipping tea from a styrofoam cup. Tiffany approached. "I saw the Berlin piece," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Did you?" She nodded. It made me feel quiet, in a good way. I didn't respond, just looked at her. She looked older too, wrinkles around her mouth, eyes softer. She sighed. "I used to think you were trying to embarrass us, and now I think you were trying not to disappear." I blinked. That was the closest thing to an apology she'd ever given. She handed me a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this a year ago. Didn't know how to send it." I opened it. Just one sentence: "I knew you were beautiful. I just didn't want to be less than you." I exhaled slowly. Not in anger. Not in relief. Just release. I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket. "Thank you." That was all I said. That was all that needed saying. On the way home, I stopped at a florist and bought wild eucalyptus and rosemary sprigs. I took them to Claudia's grave. There was no marker, by her request, just a stone bench and a tree planted in her name. I sat beneath the tree and whispered. I stayed strange. A breeze rustled the branches above me, and for a moment, I felt as though she nodded. The next month, I hosted a gathering in the studio. Not for press, not for family, just for the women who had sent me pieces of their lives in the mail over the years. I called it the mending table. 12 women came. One brought her daughter. One brought the wedding dress of her ex-wife. One brought a pillowcase that had held her child's ashes. They didn't introduce themselves with last names or careers, just first names and the object they had brought. We didn't talk about healing. We just stitched. Thread passed between fingers like breath. At one point, someone asked, "What are we making?" And I said, "Nothing. Just time." There was laughter, and silence, and that beautiful sound of thread pulling through fabric, the soft hiss of presence. As dusk fell, one of the women read a poem aloud. It wasn't planned. "We are not broken. We are the seam itself. where pain meets pattern. No one clapped. We just sat there, in the golden hour light, surrounded by fabric, shadow, and each other. I looked around the room, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was in the wrong place. I didn't feel like I had to be sharper, softer, quieter, prettier. I was exactly as I had to be. After everyone left, I walked barefoot across the studio floor, picked up a scrap of red muslin, and stitched one word into the corner. Enough. I pinned it above the window. Not for anyone else. For her. The girl with the velvet-wrapped gift. The one who had been turned away. The one who learned to stand. The one who stayed. Autumn returned like a letter with no stamp, unexpected, unannounced, but familiar in its hush. The trees began shedding everything, boldly, shamelessly, as if saying, "Here I am without decoration." I admired them. I wanted to be like that. I had spent so many years sewing new skins just to feel safe, only to discover that the softest thing I'd ever worn was truth. The garden studio smelled like cedar and dust. The tapestry known as the cloak of staying now covered one full wall. It no longer looked like a garment. It looked like a river caught mid-movement, frozen in memory. Some mornings, I'd light a candle, sit on the floor, and run my fingers along each square. I could recall every name, even if they were never written. They lived in my hands. One day, I received an email from a girl named June. She couldn't have been more than 12. Her subject line read, "You helped my sister breathe." Her message was short. Barely 3 sentences. My sister used to cry every time she looked in the mirror. Then she saw your coat in a bookstore window and said, "That looks like me." I didn't know clothes could do that. Now we're both sewing. Attached was a photo of the two of them standing in a backyard. One held a crooked little patchwork apron. The other wore a shirt with huge stitches across the front. Uneven, but determined. At the bottom of the shirt were 3 words in childlike embroidery. I still stayed. I printed the photo and taped it beside the mirror. Not to admire, just to remind myself what art really does when it's left alone to speak in its own tongue. That week, I started something new. A series of miniature garments, no bigger than a hand. One for each lie I had been told growing up. The first one was a paper-thin dress that read, "You're too loud." The second, "You'll never be pretty." The third, "Be grateful for scraps." I stitched them with the finest thread I had. I gave each a small hanger made from twisted copper wire. I didn't plan to exhibit them. I kept them in a shadow box frame labeled "Closet of Untruths." The final piece in the series took me the longest. It read, "No one will ever choose you." I used silk for that one, and gold thread, because sometimes the most dangerous lie is the one we repeat to ourselves. The day I finished it, I sat in the center of the studio, lit every candle I had, and whispered a single phrase into the stillness, "I choose me now." And I meant it. A few days later, I was invited to speak at a local arts academy. They didn't want a lecture, just a visit, a conversation. I almost declined. I wasn't sure what I had left to say, but I went. I walked into a room of 20 students, aged 16 to 19, all seated in a semicircle with sketchbooks in their laps. One girl had blue hair and ink-stained fingers. One boy wore a cape. Another sat with their back against the wall, refusing to make eye contact. I saw myself in all of them. I didn't introduce myself with accolades. I didn't say I was on the cover of Vogue. I didn't say I have a studio. I didn't mention the documentary or the archive or the museum exhibit. I said, I was told I didn't belong, so I built something where I do. They stared, and then they wrote. One of them raised their hand. "How do you keep going when no one's clapping?" I smiled. You stop listening for applause. You start listening for breath. They didn't understand fully, but one day they would. Afterward, a girl with freckles approached me, hands trembling. My brother told me my drawings were weird, she said. He laughed. But you made me think maybe weird is a door. I nodded. Weird is the doorway. Art is what you find when you step through. She hugged me before I could prepare for it. It wasn't a polite hug. It was a grip. Like she was afraid I might vanish. I stayed. When I returned home that evening, I found a box on the porch. No name, no return address. Inside a dress. Worn. Frayed. Pale yellow with a high collar and one sleeve missing. Tucked into the collar was a note. This was my mother's. She wore it the last day she spoke to me. I kept it sealed in a closet for 14 years. I thought it held her cruelty. Now I wonder if it just held her silence. I can't keep it anymore. But I thought you might know how to make it say something. I touched the fabric gently. It felt like grief, like forgiveness, like someone trying not to drown. I didn't alter it. I didn't fix it. I stitched a ribbon inside the hem that read, "I heard you." Then I hung it in the corner of the studio, beside the first door. The dresses watched each other like sisters. Weeks passed. Then one evening, as I was washing brushes in the back sink, the studio door creaked open. I turned. It was Hannah, older now. Hair silver at the roots, eyes unchanged. She held a box in her hands. "I cleaned out Mom's attic," she said. "Found something I thought you should have." She opened it. Inside were dozens of Polaroids. All of me. From every family event I thought I'd been ignored in. Someone had captured me at every gathering. Sitting alone, reading, laughing once, eyes tired, mouth tense. "Who took these, Aunt Claudia?" she said. She kept them hidden in a drawer marked Lila, proof she was always there. I sat down slowly, the photos spilling across the table like rain. She saw me. She never stopped. Hannah whispered. "She just didn't want to hand your story to them before you wrote it yourself." I placed the box beside the others. My archive had always been inside someone else's silence, and now it belonged to me. That night, I wrote a letter to the girl I once was. I placed it inside a sealed envelope and stitched it into the back of a canvas I was preparing for a new piece. No one will read it. No one needs to. But I will always know it's there, sewn beneath the surface. The letter ended with one line. "You stood in the rain, alone, and called it a hallway. One day, the door opened, and it was your name on the other side." I went to bed with the window open. No alarm set. No fear. Just the steady rhythm of a world that had finally stopped asking me to become someone else. Because I had already become the girl they tried to erase. And she had written her name in every stitch. The day I turned 34. I woke up before dawn and didn't check my phone. No notifications, no reminders, no calendar alerts blinking for attention. The studio was dark and quiet, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and cotton thread. I lit a single candle near the windowsill and sat cross-legged on the rug, wrapped in the same wool shawl I'd stitched together the year everything broke and then quietly rebuilt itself. There was no party, no champagne, no cake layered with names or jokes about aging gracefully. I had told everyone not to plan anything. This birthday wasn't about celebration. It was about marking something I couldn't quite explain, something that lived under the skin, like an echo. I spent the morning writing with a fountain pen, its ink bleeding slightly into the grain of the handmade paper. I didn't write about success or struggle. I didn't write about who had hurt me or how far I had come. I wrote only this sentence, over and over, On every page I stayed. I didn't realize I was crying until Delphine rubbed against my arm, then hissed and backed away, her tail flicking in disapproval of my wet sleeve. By noon, the sun had spilled across the studio floor in soft amber lines. I stood up, stretched, and pulled the black linen coat from the corner hook, the one I had stitched the phrase, "Silence is not absence," into years ago. It still fit, still whispered, still held every step I'd taken since the day they told me I didn't belong. I walked into town slowly, the coat trailing behind me like a shadow that had learned how to carry light. The coffee shop on Alder Street was nearly empty. The barista, a soft-spoken boy with chipped black nail polish, nodded as I entered. "Mint tea?" he asked. I nodded. He smiled. "Happy birthday?" "Lila," I remembered. That startled me more than any fame ever had, not because it was grand, but because it was ordinary, grounded. Someone remembering not what I'd done, but who I was. I took my tea and sat at the corner table by the window. Outside, an older couple walked hand in hand. A child rode by on a scooter, laughing too loudly. Someone was reading a book on a bench, their fingers tracing each line like they were learning how to feel again. It was a perfect day for remembering. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out an envelope I had been carrying for months. The name written on the front, Tiffany. We hadn't spoken since the brunch. There was no falling out, no drama, just two people walking different directions, who'd once collided like glass against glass. Inside the envelope was a letter. Not long, not vindictive. Just this: "You were never the villain. You were just louder." And I mistook that for cruelty. Maybe we both thought we had to win something. But it turns out, all we had to do was stop playing a game that never wanted either of us to rest. "You don't owe me anything, but if you ever want to stitch something beside me, the door is open." I finished my tea, folded the letter again, and walked to the post office. I didn't wait for a reply. Some letters aren't for answers, they're offerings. That afternoon, I returned to the studio and laid out the next project. It was different. No mannequins, no garments, just 12 blank canvases, each one exactly 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide. I called the series Threadlines. Instead of painting, I stitched directly into the canvas thread instead of pigment, needle instead of brush. Each panel would hold a phrase that had been said to me, or about me, not to glorify the harm, but to transform it. The first panel read, "You talk too much for someone so plain." I stitched it in charcoal gray thread, all caps, slightly crooked on purpose. The second, "Why can't you just be normal?" That one I embroidered in bright red, the letters unraveling slightly at the ends. The third was different. It read, "We didn't know she would become anything." I stitched that one in gold. Not to forgive it, to archive it. Because I had learned something through all the years of silence and spectacle. Rejection and rebirth, people will say things about you as if they're writing your obituary while you're still living. But the only one holding the pen is you. The next few weeks blurred into creation. The canvases filled the studio like standing ghosts, each one humming with stitched breath. Some were gentle, some were raw, but all of them were true. As I worked, more letters came, not from the fashion world, from strangers, girls, men, grandmothers, daughters of women who had never been told they were allowed to shine in their rawness. One letter came in an envelope made from folded muslin, inside a drawing from a child, age 7, of a faceless girl holding a thread that connected to every star in the sky. The note beneath read, "She told me the thread was her name, and the stars are the people who forgot her. But she doesn't mind, because she remembers herself." I wept. I hadn't cried like that in a long time. not out of sadness, but reverence. Reverence for how this work born in a room where I was told I didn't belong had become a cathedral for the unseen. One night, while finishing the ninth panel, I heard a knock at the studio door. I wiped my hands on a cloth and opened it. There, in the faint porch light, stood a woman I didn't recognize. She held a small box wrapped in newspaper. "Are you Lila?" "Yes." "This belonged to my sister," she said. "She died last year. She used to watch your interviews on repeat while going through chemo. Said you made her feel like her body wasn't a betrayal. She handed me the box. She wanted you to have this. Said you'd know what to do with it." I opened it after she left. Inside a pair of ballet slippers, worn to the point of threadbare, and a single photograph. The woman bawled, beaming, standing in front of a mirror wearing a dress that looked like it had been made from scraps and stories. I held the photo to my chest and whispered, "I see you." The next morning, I stitched her name into the hem of my 10th canvas, and under it, I added one line, "She danced anyway," because that, in the end, is what this whole life had become. Not revenge, not performance, not spectacle, but survival with beauty, with meaning, with refusal. Refusal to disappear, refusal to flatten, refusal to bow unless it was to honor something sacred. And so, I finished the 11th canvas, and then the 12th, and I stood in the middle of that room, no longer the girl outside the banquet hall, no longer the woman fighting to be seen, but simply Lila, the girl who stayed, the woman who stitched her way into existence, the artist who remembered what others tried to unwrite. And when I turned out the lights that night, I whispered one final phrase: I was always enough. You just didn't know where to look. And now, they do.